The whispers in the shadows. As Emilia sat at her desk, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across the pages of her journal, she felt a growing sense of unease. The whispers that had been tormenting her for weeks now seemed to have grown louder, more insistent. She could feel their presence all around her, like spectral fingers brushing against the back of her neck. With a shudder, Emilia forced herself to focus on the words flowing from her pen. Writing had always been her escape, a way to give voice to the thoughts and emotions she could never quite express out loud. And yet, tonight, the act of putting pen to paper felt labored, as if the whispers were conspiring to smother her creativity. She paused, rereading the last few lines she had written. They felt hollow, lacking the depth and authenticity she normally strived for. Emilia sighed, setting down her pen and rubbing her temples. Perhaps she was simply overworked, her nerves frayed by the demands of running the family estate on her own. Ever since her parents' untimely deaths a year ago, the burden of responsibility had weighed heavily upon her. Emilia's gaze drifted to the clock on the mantel, its hands creeping towards the witching hour. She should retire for the night, but the thought of traversing the dark, silent halls of the manor filled her with dread. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching and waiting. No, she would stay here in the relative safety of her study. Emilia rose from her chair and began to methodically bank the fire, ensuring it would smolder gently through the night. As she moved about the room, she couldn't shake the persistent feeling of being observed. Pausing, she scanned the dim corners, half expecting to see some lurking figure emerge from the gloom. Nothing, just the usual array of shadowy shapes cast by the flickering firelight. With a sigh, Emilia returned to her desk, sinking back into the worn leather chair. She stared down at the journal, willing the words to come. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a fleeting movement, a shift in the shadows by the bookshelf. Emilia's heart raced as she whipped her head around, but once again, there was nothing to be seen. "This is ridiculous," she muttered aloud, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. She was letting her imagination run wild, that was all. Still, an uneasy feeling settled over her, a growing conviction that she was not alone in this room. Emilia rose from her chair, her steps slow and deliberate as she began to circle the study, carefully inspecting each dark corner. As she approached the bookshelves, she paused, her gaze drawn to a single volume that seemed to stand out from the others, an old leather-bound tome with faded gilt lettering on the spine. Curious, Emilia reached out and pulled the book from the shelf, blowing the dust from its cover. The whispers seemed to grow louder, almost beckoning her to open it. Hesitantly, she did so, her fingers tracing the ornate title page. Whispers from the Shadows, a treatise on the occult. Emilia's brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages, her eyes skimming over passages describing rituals, incantations, and warnings about the dangers of tampering with forces beyond human comprehension. With a growing sense of unease, she snapped the book shut, returning it hastily to the shelf. As she did so, a sudden chill seemed to permeate the room, and Emilia felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Slowly, she turned, her gaze drawn to the far corner of the study, where the shadows appeared deeper, more impenetrable. And then she saw it, A fleeting movement, a shifting of the darkness that could not be explained by the flickering firelight. Emilia's breath caught in her throat as she stared transfixed, her heart pounding in her ears. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. The shadows seemed to ripple and undulate, as if in response. Emilia felt a growing sense of unease as she watched, unable to tear her gaze away. And then a shape began to emerge, slowly coalescing out of the darkness, a humanoid figure, its features indistinct, shrouded in inky blackness. Emilia took a step backward, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some trick of the light, some figment of her overactive imagination. And yet, the presence that now filled the room felt palpable, a tangible force that seemed to suck the very breath from her lungs. "What are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice quavering. The figure remained silent, its amorphous form shifting and undulating, as if it were made of living shadow. Emilia felt a growing sense of panic, a primal fear that clawed at the edges of her consciousness. She wanted to run, to flee this oppressive, haunted room, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The shadows seemed to ripple and undulate, as if in response. Emilia felt a growing sense of unease as she watched, unable to tear her gaze away. And then a shape began to emerge, slowly coalescing out of the darkness, a humanoid figure, its features indistinct, shrouded in inky blackness. Emilia took a step backward, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some trick of the light, some figment of her overactive imagination. And yet, the presence that now filled the room felt palpable, a tangible force that seemed to suck the very breath from her lungs. "What are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice quavering. The figure remained silent, its amorphous form shifting and undulating, as if it were made of living shadow. Emilia felt a growing sense of panic, a primal fear that clawed at the edges of her consciousness. She wanted to run, to flee this oppressive, haunted room, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. And then, the whispers began again, a chorus of faint, sibilant voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Emilia strained to make out the words, but they were indistinct, impossible to decipher. All she knew was that they filled her with a sense of dread, a foreboding that something unspeakable was about to occur. The shadowy figure began to move, gliding across the floor towards her, and Emilia felt a scream building in her throat. But before she could give voice to it, a piercing pain lanced through her head, and the world went dark. When Emilia opened her eyes, she found herself lying on the floor of her study, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows all around her. Her head throbbed, and she reached up to gingerly touch the back of her skull, wincing at the tenderness. With a deep breath, Emilia closed the journal and rose to her feet, her gaze sweeping the room one last time. The study seemed still and quiet, the only sound the faint crackle of the dying embers in the fireplace. Yet Emilia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following her every move. She knew she could no longer ignore the ominous presence that had taken root within these walls. Steeling herself, Emilia made her way out of the study, her steps quickening as she traversed the dark, silent halls of the manor. She would have to investigate further, to uncover the truth behind the whispers in the shadows. But for now, she knew she needed to rest, to regain her strength. Tomorrow, she would begin her search, no matter where it might lead. Whatever lurked in the darkness, she was determined to confront it, to reclaim the safety and solace of her own home. As Emilia retired to her bedchamber, the whispers seemed to follow her, faint but persistent. She tried to push them from her mind, to focus on the task that lay ahead. But try as she might, she couldn't silence the unsettling feeling that the shadows were closing in, that the whispers were only the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying ordeal. The next morning, Emilia awoke with a start, her heart racing. The whispers had followed her even into her dreams, an endless chorus of indistinct murmurs that left her feeling unsettled and on edge. She lay in bed, staring up at the canopy, trying to gather her scattered thoughts. What exactly had happened in the study last night? Had the shadowy figure she'd seen been real, or merely a figment of her imagination? Emilia shuddered, recalling the piercing pain that had overwhelmed her before the world went dark. Whatever the case, it was clear that the manor was no longer the safe haven she had always known. With a resolute sigh, Emilia rose from her bed, dressing quickly. She needed answers, and sitting idle would only allow the whispers to grow louder, the shadows to encroach further. Making her way downstairs, she headed straight for the study, her steps quickening as she approached the closed door. Emilia paused, her hand hovering over the handle. Part of her was tempted to simply turn back, to flee the manor altogether and seek refuge elsewhere. But she knew that would only be a temporary solution. Whatever evil had taken root here would continue to haunt her, no matter where she went. Steeling herself, Emilia pushed open the door and stepped inside, her gaze immediately drawn to the open journal on the desk. The pages fluttered in the faint breeze, as if beckoning her to read the hastily scrawled words. With a deep breath, she approached and began to scan the entries, her brow furrowing as the reality of her situation began to sink in. It was clear now that the whispers were no mere figment of her imagination. They were a tangible, malevolent force, one that seemed to have an unsettling awareness of her very thoughts and fears. And the shadowy figure she had glimpsed, that too was no dream. It was real, a harbinger of something far more sinister. Emilia's fingers trembled as she closed the journal, her mind racing. She needed to find a way to uncover the truth, to confront this supernatural menace before it consumed her completely. But where would she even begin? As if in answer to her unspoken question, Emilia's gaze landed on the leather-bound tome she had discovered the previous night, the treatise on the occult. Crossing the room, she retrieved the book, her heart pounding as she flipped through the pages once more. The text was dense, filled with esoteric terminology and arcane rituals that, at first glance, seemed to hold little relevance to her current predicament. And yet, as Emilia read on, a growing sense of dread began to take hold. The book spoke of ancient, malevolent entities that could manifest in the physical world, entities that fed on the fear and suffering of their victims. Emilia swallowed hard, her mind racing. Could it be possible that such dark forces had indeed taken root within the manor? And if so, how could she possibly hope to confront them, let alone defeat them? Determined, Emilia began to scour the study, searching for any additional clues or resources that might shed light on the nature of the threat she was facing. As she rifled through the cluttered bookshelves, her fingers brushed against a slim volume, its spine barely visible among the tomes. Pulling it free, Emilia's breath caught in her throat. It was a journal similar to her own, but the cover was emblazoned with a strange, arcane symbol. A circular design with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift before her eyes. Hands trembling, Emilia opened the journal, her eyes widening as she recognized the elegant, flowing script. It belonged to her father, a man she had thought long dead and buried. The entries chronicled his own harrowing encounter with the Whispers in the Shadows, a battle that had ultimately cost him his life. Emilia read on, her heart racing, as her father's words described a malevolent entity that had taken root in the manor, feeding off the fear and despair of its occupants. As Emilia neared the end of the journal, a sense of dread settled over her. Her father had been close, so close to uncovering the means to banish the dark presence forever. But in the end, he had been overcome, his life sacrificed in a final, desperate attempt to save his family. Emilia closed the journal, her hands shaking. She now understood the true nature of the threat she faced and the weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. If she failed, she would suffer the same fate as her father, and the Whispers would continue to echo through the manor, feeding on the fear and torment of all who dared to remain. With a new resolve, Emilia began to meticulously study her father's journal, searching for any clues or insights that might aid her in her quest to vanquish the darkness. She knew the battle ahead would be arduous, fraught with peril, but she was determined to reclaim her home, to silence the Whispers that had haunted her for far too long. As the days turned into weeks, Emilia delved deeper into the occult, mastering arcane rituals and techniques that, she hoped, would give her the power to confront the entity that had taken root in the manor. She moved with caution, aware that even the slightest misstep could have devastating consequences. And all the while, the Whispers persisted, growing ever louder, ever more insistent. Emilia could feel them scratching at the edges of her consciousness, tormenting her with visions of dark, shadowy figures that seemed to materialize from the very walls. But she refused to be cowed, refused to surrender to the fear that threatened to consume her. Instead, she channeled her determination, her resolve, into the rituals and spells she had painstakingly learned. She would not rest until the manor was cleansed of the darkness, until the Whispers were silenced forever. And then, one fateful night, as Emilia stood at the center of a complex, glowing sigil drawn upon the floor of the study, she felt the shift in the air, the sudden charge of energy that signaled the presence of the entity she had come to know as her sworn enemy. The shadows seemed to coalesce, forming the same amorphous figure she had encountered before, its features indistinct and menacing. Emilia steeled herself, her hands steady as she began to recite the ancient incantation, her voice ringing out with a newfound power and conviction. The entity recoiled, its form twisting and writhing as the words washed over it. Emilia pressed on, pouring every ounce of her willpower into the ritual, her mind singularly focused on banishing the darkness that had plagued her home. And as the final syllables of the incantation faded into the charged silence, Emilia watched in awe as the shadowy figure began to dissolve, its essence unraveling like tendrils of smoke caught in a gale. The Whispers too faded, their eerie chorus reduced to a faint, mournful wail that echoed through the manor before dissipating into nothingness. Emilia stood there, her chest heaving, her mind reeling from the sheer intensity of the experience. She had done it, She had reclaimed her home, her sanctuary, from the dark forces that had sought to consume it. And as she surveyed the now quiet study, she felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment wash over her. The whispers in the shadows had been silenced, and Emilia knew that she could finally begin to rebuild her life, free from the burdens and terrors that had haunted her for so long. It would not be an easy road, but she was ready, armed with the knowledge and power she had fought so hard to attain. With a deep breath, Emilia turned and left the study, the door closing softly behind her. The manor felt different now, the oppressive, ominous atmosphere replaced by a sense of tranquility and perhaps even hope. She knew that the battle was not truly over, that there would always be shadows lurking, waiting to be confronted. But for now, Emilia was content to take solace in her hard-won victory, to savor the silence that had replaced the whispers that had once tormented her so. She had faced her demons, and she had emerged triumphant. And as she made her way through the now peaceful halls of the manor, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to reclaim her life and her future, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The whispers in the shadows